The Sony FX30 is the best video camera on the market. Or is it? Does Canon have a better camera in the R6 Mark II? We've got your buying guide coming up next. But first, I encourage you to subscribe and choose all notifications so you stay up to date on the latest camera gear, news, and rumors. Sony just announced the FX30, a video camera positioned well to sell, and selling it is. An APS-C version of the FX3 and the Sony a7S III, but at $1,798, that's less than half the price of the FX3. Is the Sony the best camera for the ordinary filmmaker, or should you get the Canon R6 Mark II? Canon included a lot of upgrades to the video capabilities, causing pre-orders to exceed expectations. And 2 days after opening up pre-orders, Canon put out a notice stating its demand already exceeded supply. I get it, the Canon R6 is a mini 1DX Mark III. It's aimed at photographers rather than videographers, but the R6 Mark II saw major improvements to the video capabilities, with some asking, but how well does it score against the Sony FX30? And when it comes to video, videographers really don't care about sensor size. That the R6 Mark II has a larger sensor. What we really care about, is the amount of dynamic range or low light performance. The FX30 has one stop less dynamic range when compared against the FX3, but the R6 has a full frame sensor like the a7S III and the FX3, giving it an edge in dynamic range over the FX30. And while the Sony FX30 isn't far behind, the R6 with a larger sensor has an edge over the Sony, so 1 point to Canon. And while the Sony FX30 isn't too far behind the Canon EOS R6, especially with dual gain ISO, the R6 still has the edge with that larger sensor with more dynamic range and low light performance, so 1 point to Canon. And despite having that larger sensor, the Canon EOS R6 Mark II does have a lower resolution, lower than the FX30, 26 megapixels for the Sony versus 24.2 megapixels for the Canon EOS R6. So that's 26.1 megapixels for the Sony versus 24.2 megapixels for the Canon EOS R6. So in this case, a point to Sony. The Sony FX30 offers dual ISO, which gives it an edge in video modes such as 4K 120. So that's another 2 points for Sony, one for dual ISO and the other for 4K at 120 frames per second. So this essentially helps close that gap between these two cameras, the FX30 and the Canon EOS R6 Mark II. However, there are a few other capabilities here that are worth mentioning. When it comes to video, both cameras are limited to 4K, but some are more limited than others. The Canon EOS R6 Mark II is capable of 4K, but caps out at 60 frames per second, whereas the Sony FX30 goes all the way up to 120 frames per second. The FX30 is also capable 16-bit output over HDMI, not internal recording, but that far exceeds what's available on the Canon EOS R6 Mark II. Wow, if the Canon had raw output, Apple ProRes raw out, well, that would certainly close the gap, but in this case, it's pretty obvious. 1 point goes to Sony. I've been doing run-and-gun documentary-style filmmaking for many, many years, and the one thing I count on, the one thing that's really changed how I approach this, because I do run-and-gun, a reliable autofocus system, a fast, reliable autofocus system that does human eye detection, subject detection, torso detection. Whether you're driving a vehicle, whether you're walking or running, having a reliable autofocus system makes a huge difference. And both of these camera companies, Sony and Canon, have a very good top-shelf autofocus system. Whether one is better than the other really depends on what you're looking at, depending on how far away you are from a given lens, the type of lens you've got hooked up to the camera, the type of environmental conditions, whether you're shooting in this mode versus that mode. I mean, you could argue that one is better than the other, but essentially, both Sony and Canon have a very good autofocus system. So whether you buy the FX30 or the Canon EOS R6 Mark II, I'm going to have to give a point to both camera companies here because they both deliver a really solid autofocus system, and both companies are continuing to spend an awful lot of time on research and development into their autofocus systems. I wonder, who's going to be the first to develop UFO auto detection? Will it be Sony or Canon? This almost has to be one of the most important capabilities, and it wasn't until a couple of years ago when cameras started moving into 4K video. We started to see cameras overheating after 10 minutes, 15 minutes, or even less. And the Canon EOS R5, well, that set a record. If you were playing around in, well, stills, shooting pictures for an hour or two, and you tried to shoot anything in video, the camera would say, sorry, no time. I'm overheating. So yes, overheating matters. So where do these two cameras stand? Well, the FX30 doesn't overheat, at least not that's been reported so far. The camera's only been out for a few months. And in terms of that 30-minute record limit, Well, Sony hasn't had that 30-minute record limit for a long time, but taking a look over at Canon, the R6, well, it had a 30-minute record limit and it overheated at 40 minutes. Whereas the R6 Mark II, well, we no longer have that 30-minute record limit, so a bit of a shout out to Canon. Good job, Canon. Thank you for finally getting rid of that 30-minute record limit. It's awesome. Welcome to the 21st century. But in terms of overheating, well, it's a bit more complex. If you're shooting in your basic frame rates of 24, 25, and 30 frames per second, so far, based on the test, and we've had limited testing of this camera right now because it's in pre-order mode, we don't see the camera out to a lot of people, but based on shooting in those basic frame rates, there's been no sign of overheating. However, shoot outside those video resolutions and frame rates, and yes, the camera does tend to overheat, although it's somewhere north of 40 minutes. So in this case, we got to give a point once again to Sony for the lack of overheating and any sort of record limits. But again, an honorable mention to Canon. Let's go ahead and give them a 0.2 on this one. To be able to answer that question, we need to be able to look at how many lenses are available to the platform. Now, the Canon EF mount, that's been around since like 86 or 85. It's many decades of producing some, well, 107 lenses. And all those lenses can be adapted to the Canon EOS R6 Mark II. So can a whole myriad of third-party EF lenses. And then, of course, Canon also has some RF lenses. There's probably something like 12 to 15 of them right now. Not a huge amount. After all, this mount just came out a few years ago. So Canon does offer an awful lot of lenses out there. There's a huge used market, as well as you're able to buy a whole bunch of lenses new. And so widely respected is the EF mount that you see camera companies like Red and Blackmagic solidifying on it as a standard for their cameras. But Sony isn't any slouch either. While Sony's a little later to the game when it comes to lenses, Sony realized they had to offer something to their customers to, well, provide them with a whole lot of lens opportunities. And what Sony did was, well, brilliant. They opened up their mount so that anybody that wanted to develop a lens for the Sony E-mount could do so. So while Canon might have the edge in some respects, Sony opening up their E-mount gives you at least, well, no shortage of lenses. And I know many filmmakers, Canadian filmmakers that have produced documentaries that are on television, that have gone to TIFF, that have won awards. And you know what? They're shooting with Sony cameras and they're shooting with the lenses that are available to them. Same with Canon shooters. So I'm going to have to go ahead and give Sony a point for this one, but also give Canon a point. So 1 point for each. Congratulations. As you can plainly see, Sony's winning. So Sony's the best camera, right? No, I mean, this is silly. This is absolutely stupid and asinine. Me sitting here telling you based on a whole bunch of capabilities that Sony's got a point and that Canon's got a point, that because Sony has more points, it's the best camera, it's absolutely ridiculous. And so is any other video out there doing the same thing. What really matters is the outcomes that you're expecting to get from a camera. And of course, the shooting scenarios. How are you planning on using this camera? Where are you planning on using it? For example, if you're a wedding photographer that shoots an awful lot of stills, but you also need a camera that can shoot an awful lot of video, but you're not shooting 2-3 hours on end, well then, you know what? The Canon EOS R6 Mark II will more or less work for you. Plus, if you have a whole bunch of Canon glass, yeah, I would say go get the Canon EOS R6 Mark II, no matter how many fewer points it scores over the Sony. And if you're a YouTuber or a documentarian, somebody who's shooting videos for a living, where you can be shooting for up to 2 hours doing an interview or 3 hours, if you're doing corporate work, you don't want to have to worry about overheating, you don't want to have to worry about time limits or anything like that, then clearly the Sony FX30 is a bargain at $1,798, and I highly recommend getting this camera. The one thing that I would have to knock Canon for is they just don't have a camera that properly compares against the FX30. There's no, well, low-end cinema version, and while yes, there is a rumored camera, the Canon R7, the Canon R7C. It's a rumor, and when it comes to rumors, there's nothing of substance on the table that we can purchase. Right now, there's a huge hole in Canon's lineup, Nikon's as well, addressing the FX30. If your bread and butter is doing videos, whether you're doing corporate events, whether you're doing documentaries, whether you're doing other sorts of filmmaking, you're doing indie films, and you're on a tight budget, it's really hard to argue against the Sony FX30, a camera with all the same capabilities as the Sony FX3, which is based off of the, well, Sony a7S III. The same capabilities for less than half the price, and it produces really good results. And in terms of dynamic range and low light performance, well, the FX30 isn't that much worse than the FX3. It's hard not to recommend the FX30, but that doesn't mean in any way whatsoever that the Canon EOS R6 Mark II is a bad camera. Again, what are the capabilities that you're looking for? What are the outcomes? What are the results you expect from a camera? And what are your shooting scenarios? And if you can identify that and you're still unsure, then go ahead and post that information in the comment section down below, and I'll help you pick the right camera. It could be the FX30, it could be the R6 Mark II, or it could be a completely different camera altogether. And if you want to stay up to date on all the latest camera news and rumors, all the latest reviews, my buying guides, then go ahead and subscribe and choose all notifications. By choosing all notifications, as soon as I publish a new video like this one here, well, you'll get notified by YouTube, so that way you can stay up to date on all the latest camera news and rumors. And boy, does that save you a lot of time from having to scrub Twitter feeds, RSS feeds, all your favorite websites, your YouTube channels, print magazines, books, whatever it is. You see, I cover all the major camera brands, all the major camera models. I do I do rumors, reviews, and buying guides. So all that right here in one spot. So if time matters to you, go ahead and subscribe and choose all notifications. That's it for now. Have yourself a great weekend. We'll see you again soon.